Addiction to alcohol and prohibited substances stands as one of the most serious and dangerous conditions, often posing life-threatening risks not only to the individual suffering, but especially to their family members, who frequently make desperate attempts to help. The tragic story of young student Lauren Malt, which took place in Norfolk County in 2022, shocked the nation with the unimaginable cruelty directed at a child by her own parent. The head of the household, who had long struggled with alcohol and substance dependency, exhibited aggression toward his wife and their 4 children. The family endured this, hoping they could help him. His daughter, Lauren, believed in him most of all. She continued to stay in contact with her father even after her parents separated amidst turmoil. Ultimately, her loyalty and desire to help came at the highest personal cost. The Malt family background. Karen Malt, née Benson, was born and raised in the small town of West Winch in Norfolk County, England, in a modest, middle-income family. She was a diligent student and, upon finishing school, went on to college, dreaming of a future career in economics and finance. While a student, Karen met a young man named Nigel Malt, who was a few years older than she was. The small age difference didn't concern them, and before long, a romantic relationship developed between them. Karen's parents approved of her choice, as Nigel was intelligent, promising, had serious career ambitions, and was actively involved in sports. Less than 6 months after they began their relationship, Karen became pregnant. The young couple rushed to marry and moved to King's Lynn, a port city in western Norfolk, where Nigel had been offered a good job. Karen had to leave her studies but planned to complete her education once their child was a little older. On April 8, 2002, the couple welcomed their firstborn, a daughter named Lauren. The young parents were thrilled and adored their little girl, striving to create the most comfortable environment for her. At that time, Nigel had just received a promotion, earning a good income that allowed him to support the whole family on his own. Karen never had the chance to return to her studies, as she soon became pregnant again, and again. In short order, the Malt family welcomed 3 more children, all sons. After that, Karen devoted herself entirely to motherhood, raising their children and managing the household. The family moved to a larger home where each child had their own room, and Nigel's income allowed them a comfortable life, living under the same roof as a monster. On the surface, the Malt family's life looked perfect in every way. Loving spouses, a big, cozy home, financial security, and 4 cherished children born every few years. Nigel was climbing the career ladder, the family was comfortable, and they seemed genuinely happy. In fact, the early years of the Malt's marriage were indeed filled with happiness. It all started when Nigel, back in his college days, began experimenting with various prohibited substances. This habit ultimately ended his potential career in sports. Many once saw him as a promising soccer player. At first, he only used light substances, which helped boost his mood and productivity, but didn't have a noticeable impact on his behavior. Since he only used these boosters occasionally, most people close to him were completely unaware. Karen learned of her husband's habits only after their marriage, but at the time, she didn't see it as a serious issue. Nigel assured her that he could stop anytime, claiming he wasn't truly dependent, and young, naive Karen believed him. However, over time, Nigel not only began using substances more regularly, but also started increasing the dosage. As he advanced in his career and more money started flowing in, Nigel lost control and went to extremes. He experimented with everything he could buy, mixing various types and dosages, and began heavily abusing alcohol. He even stocked an entire cellar with different types of liquor. Nigel's personality and behavior deteriorated gradually, so at first, it didn't seem like a significant issue. It started with minor irritations, nitpicking, and frequent arguments over trivial matters. Karen understood what the real problem was and repeatedly suggested that her husband seek professional help, but these conversations always ended in heated arguments, which soon escalated to physical aggression. The situation worsened when Karen was expecting their second child, but she hoped that the arrival of their son would inspire Nigel to change. However, after their son was born, things only got worse and continued to spiral downward, even as they welcomed 4 children into the family. Karen kept silent and tried not to discuss what was happening at home, even with her own parents. Yet soon, people around them began to suspect that things weren't right in the Malt household. The young mother frequently appeared with large bruises on her face and body, which she often dismissed as accidents due to her own clumsiness and lack of attention. Nigel's descent into darkness. Under the influence of alcohol and prohibited substances, Nigel began to turn into a different person. A person who was fierce, unpredictable, and even dangerous. It had been a long time since his aggression was limited to verbal insults. Now he let his fists do the talking. After the effects of substances and alcohol wore off, however, he would beg his wife to forgive him, promising that it would never happen again. Once their eldest daughter started school, she too became a target. During episodes of aggression, Lauren would try to protect her mother, but her father's anger spared no one. She was deeply afraid of him, yet she continued to love him, clinging to the hope that he would return to the caring father she once knew. Karen often thought about leaving, taking the children, and filing for divorce to get away from her unpredictable and dangerous husband. However, as a mother of several children with no education or work experience, she was financially dependent on him. Leaving would mean dividing the house, the family's possessions, and most importantly, the children's custody. Nigel could afford a good attorney, which might enable him to take custody, just to spite her. And memories of the good years they had shared in the beginning were still fresh, keeping alive her hope that he might once again become the man she had fallen in love with. Hitting rock bottom. As the years went by, Nigel's addictions became impossible to hide. He began drinking and using prohibited substances at all hours, sometimes even at work. Since he was a respected employee, his company initially attempted to help by arranging for him to attend a private rehab program, but he flatly refused. Nigel's productivity dropped to almost nothing. He caused constant problems and financial losses for his employer, who eventually demoted him in the hopes it might serve as a wake-up call. However, when he failed to improve, they ultimately let him go. Once an ambitious, successful professional, he barely managed to secure a low-paying job with no prospects, one that hardly kept him afloat. From that point on, he began spending the family's savings, which had been set aside for the children's education. He instigated arguments daily, physically attacked Karen, and blamed her for all his misfortunes. Occasionally, the children bore the brunt of his anger too. But in rare, sober moments, Nigel would once again plead for forgiveness, promising to turn his life around. He manipulated the family's sympathy, particularly Lauren's, who continued to believe that her father's promises were genuine. Attempted crime and escape with the children. In the spring of 2021, Karen brought up the topic of divorce once again, feeling that she couldn't endure their situation any longer. Her husband initially tried to gain her sympathy, promising to change and seek help, but Karen held firm in her decision. Nigel then flew into a rage, throwing and smashing everything in his path. He threatened her, began to treat her aggressively, and ultimately pushed her down a flight of stairs. Desperate, Karen sought help from the police. She reported the domestic aggression and provided hospital records documenting her injuries, including bruises, hematomas, a couple of broken ribs, and a head injury. Initially, law enforcement didn't take the case very seriously and only gave Nigel a warning. But 3 weeks later, when Nigel attempted to strangle Karen, only to be interrupted by their daughter's unexpected return home, the case finally began to gain traction. When the authorities detained him, Karen quickly packed essentials, took her children, and left for her parents' home in the rural town of West Winch. Realizing what had happened, Nigel called her repeatedly, begging her to return, saying he couldn't live without her and the children, even threatening to harm himself. However, Karen was no longer swayed by his manipulative behavior and filed for divorce. Karen's goal was not only to end the marriage, but also to secure a restraining order, to prevent her aggressive husband from approaching her and the children. With documented complaints of physical aggression, his severe dependencies, and his destructive behavior, he stood no chance of gaining custody. But despite the circumstances, the court ultimately denied her request for a restraining order, ruling that the threats, aggression, and even the attempted assault were insufficient grounds for one. Meanwhile, Nigel was released on bail, leaving his family feeling unsafe even in another town. The compassionate daughter. Karen and the children decided to stay at her mother's house while waiting for the divorce and property division to be settled in court. Left without financial support and with 4 children to care for, Karen took a job as a cashier at a local supermarket to have at least some source of income. However, money was still critically tight. 18-year-old Lauren, who had just started college, took on multiple part-time jobs to help her mother in any way she could, Lauren's loyalty and her father's obsession. Since childhood, Lauren had always been a kind, responsible, and compassionate girl. She took it upon herself to help with household chores and looked after her younger brothers, hoping to ease her mother's burden as much as she could. She stood up for her mom and constantly tried to reconcile her parents, believing deep down that their family could someday be happy again. Even after she and her family moved in with her grandmother, Lauren stayed in touch with her father, unwilling to completely lose her connection with him. They would occasionally talk on the phone and sometimes even meet up just to talk. In those rare moments when Nigel was clear-headed, he would ask for her forgiveness, promising to stop drinking and using prohibited substances. He would even ask Lauren to talk to her mother, hoping she might forgive him and return home, as he claimed to miss them deeply. But more often than not, he was far from sober when he called. He'd hurl accusations, threats, and insults at Lauren, blaming her for the family's separation because she had always sided with her mother and supported her decision to leave. Despite this, Lauren tried her best to remain calm, not responding with anger or challenging him. Instead, she listened and attempted to soothe him, clinging to the belief that somewhere within him, her once loving father still existed. The father she remembered from her childhood. What did he want? Karen and her children lived in West Winch for nearly a year, and during that time, Lauren kept in touch with her father. Amazingly, he even remembered her 19th birthday and called to wish her well, though the majority of his calls were filled with anger and verbal attacks. In the summer of 2021, Lauren met a young man named Arthur, and a romantic relationship developed between them. Even with her busy schedule, attending college, working evening shifts at a store, helping her mother, and balancing a budding relationship, she managed to hold everything together. On Sunday evening, January 23, 2022, Lauren was working a shift at the store, and Arthur had planned to pick her up after work. Her father had been calling repeatedly that day, but she couldn't answer as she was swamped with tasks. Nigel, however, wouldn't stop. His repeated calls were an unmistakable sign that he was under the influence of alcohol or prohibited substances. When Lauren finally had a moment to pick up, her father was already agitated. He yelled at her, calling her ungrateful, hurling insults at both her and her mother and threatening them. Lauren tried to calm him down, explaining that she was at work and couldn't talk, but he wasn't listening. Eventually, she had to end the conversation, seeing no way to reach him. Her father seemed only more riled up after that, calling her every few minutes. Lauren held firm, not picking up, hoping he would eventually settle down. Then the calls suddenly stopped. She breathed a sigh of relief, finished her shift, and by 6 p.m., Arthur picked her up to go back to her place. No one was home, and they looked forward to a quiet, romantic evening. Around 6:30 p.m., Nigel's calls resumed, and within 30 minutes, he had dialed Lauren's number over 20 times. She knew this couldn't continue, so she picked up. Immediately, she was met with insults, threats, and his angry declaration that he was coming over. Fear took hold. She knew just how unpredictable he could be in his state. Ran over his own daughter, twice. Approximately 20 minutes after his last call, Nigel pulled up to his ex-wife's house in his Mercedes. Enraged and out of control, he emerged from the car wielding a crowbar, swinging it as he approached. Lauren tried to calm him down, but he was too far gone to listen. Arthur, Lauren's boyfriend, stepped in to protect her and narrowly avoided a blow aimed at his head. Nigel threatened to harm Arthur, and Lauren urged her boyfriend to step back into the house, reassuring him that she could convince her father to leave. Arthur retreated, and Lauren once again tried to reason with her father. Remarkably, she managed to get him to sit back in his car. For a moment it seemed he was about to leave. But just as the car started moving forward with Lauren standing behind it, Nigel suddenly reversed, hitting and running her over. He paused briefly, illuminating her injured, screaming form in his headlights, then accelerated again, driving over her a second time. It all happened so quickly that Arthur nearby could do nothing to intervene. In shock, he hadn't anticipated such brutality from Nigel, and was momentarily frozen in disbelief. He ran toward Lauren, shouting, as a neighbor rushed over to help, dialing emergency services upon seeing the severity of the situation. Lauren lay on the driveway in an unnatural position, looking as fragile as a broken doll. Her cries had subsided to weak moans, blood flowed from her mouth and nose, and open wounds covered her body. Bloody tire marks stained the driveway. Moving her could have been fatal, and immediate medical help was essential. However, Nigel insisted he would drive Lauren to the hospital himself, scooping her up roughly. Her boyfriend and the neighbor, afraid to struggle with him while he held her, stood by, worried about causing further injury. Nigel shoved her into the passenger seat without securing her with a seatbelt, causing her to slump onto the floor. He continued to mutter assurances, insisting he'd get her medical help and that everything would be fine. Without waiting, Nigel jumped behind the wheel and sped away from the scene. She had no chance of survival. Of course, Nigel had no intention of taking his dying daughter to the hospital. Instead, he called his ex-wife, who was still at work, and informed her that there had been an accident involving Lauren, but assured her that everything was fine and that he was bringing their daughter over. His speech was slurred and incoherent, immediately signaling to Karen that he was heavily intoxicated. At first, she didn't feel overly alarmed, assuming nothing too serious had happened. But as he rambled on, a growing sense of dread took hold, and she began to fear for her daughter. Nigel arrived directly in the parking lot of the supermarket where Karen worked. She stepped outside to meet him, unprepared for the horrifying sight before her. On the floor of the car, Lauren lay crumpled in an unnatural position, seemingly unresponsive. Her clothes were soaked in blood, a broken bone protruded from her forearm, and her overall state was catastrophic. Karen tried to lift her daughter, but was unable to move her. She immediately called emergency services, and medics arrived within minutes. Tragically, there was little they could do. Lauren was quickly rushed to the hospital, taken straight to the operating room in critical condition. But within minutes, doctors pronounced her dead. An autopsy later revealed that Lauren's injuries were so severe she had virtually no chance of survival. She had suffered a double spinal fracture with spinal cord damage, ruptured internal organs, massive internal bleeding, and a chest crushed to the point where broken ribs had punctured her lungs. This was in addition to broken limbs and a traumatic brain injury. The disturbing crime scene. Law enforcement was immediately dispatched to Karen's home, where the traumatized witnesses, Arthur and a neighbor, were already waiting. Bloodstains and tire tracks still marked the driveway, and both men confirmed that Lauren's intoxicated father had run over her twice. Investigators took tire impressions to match with Nigel's car as a formal procedure, though the truth was already apparent. Both witnesses were shaken by what they had seen, convinced that Nigel had acted deliberately, intending to harm Lauren by running her over twice. Arthur, retelling the events through tears, blamed himself for being unable to intervene and save his girlfriend. The story, according to the father. Nigel was arrested that same evening, but due to his extreme intoxication from alcohol and prohibited substances, He was unable to provide coherent testimony. He was taken for a medical examination, which confirmed his blood alcohol levels were off the charts, and the substances he'd taken had made him highly aggressive. His primary concern seemed to be the possibility of losing his driver's license, with little, if any, apparent remorse for his daughter's death. It took more than a day for Nigel to regain enough awareness to understand what had happened and the gravity of the situation he was facing. When he finally did, he concocted a bizarre, implausible account of events, claiming it had all been a tragic accident, insisting he would never harm his daughter intentionally. According to his story, he was indeed very angry that evening because Lauren wasn't answering his calls. He decided to drive over to her house to talk in person, only to find her with her boyfriend, Arthur, which allegedly led to a confrontation. Nigel claimed that Arthur had told him to leave in a rude manner, and while he intended to comply, he backed up abruptly and felt himself hit something. He supposedly didn't realize what it was and, after driving over it, decided to move forward to clear the obstacle, unaware it was his daughter. Nigel insisted that he only understood something was wrong when he heard Arthur's panicked screams. When he saw Lauren lying in a pool of blood, he decided he could get her to the hospital faster on his own, but thought it best to stop by Karen's workplace so that she could be with their daughter. The trial and verdict. No one believed Nigel's version, as witnesses testified that it was a deliberate, brutal act. Additionally, the fact that he was under the influence of both substances and alcohol only intensified the seriousness of his actions. The incident had even been captured on a nearby surveillance camera, the footage of which left no doubt about the deliberate nature of the crime. During interrogations, Nigel maintained a calm and confident demeanor, continuously asserting his innocence and claiming it had all been a tragic accident. However, he spoke disparagingly about both his ex-wife and his late daughter, blaming them for all his troubles. The court ordered that Nigel remain in custody without bail until trial. His health rapidly declined while in prison, and when court proceedings began in September 2022, the 45-year-old appeared in court on crutches, struggling to walk, his legs weakened from years of heavy drinking and substance abuse. Ultimately, the court found Nigel guilty of the deliberate and brutal crime against his daughter, sentencing him to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole no sooner than 18 years. Karen was satisfied with the verdict, yet she vowed to attend every parole hearing to ensure that her ex-husband, who had taken their daughter's life, would never walk free again.